We are looking at a lesson that has been entitled Comfort My People, Isaiah chapter 40. And I've got to say, I found this the most exciting lesson I've studied so far out of Isaiah. And yet, the teachers who chose lessons to teach left this one because I didn't pick till right towards the end. And when there was about 2 or 3 left, I thought I'd better have a look and see if one of these lessons might suit me. And I thought, this would be a nice one. It kind of connects with, the 2 parts of Isaiah together, so I'll take this one. But it's an amazing chapter, I'm sure you would agree with me. To begin with, I'd just like to share you a little story from one of my favourite authors. He's an archaeologist, of course, Dr. Siegfried Horn. And probably the thing that we know him best for is the fact that he is the author of the 8th volume of the Adventist commentary series, and it's a Bible dictionary, the SDA Bible Dictionary. And Dr. Horn, who has also conscripted the source of others as well, but he's the major contributor to that, and he also contributed a lot to the commentaries as well. And there's an interesting story about him that I only just found out by listening to somebody else's Sabbath school online to hear this story. And it was my cousin, actually, Lloyd Willis, who was telling the story about Dr. Siegfried Horn, because he has worked with Dr. Siegfried Horn in his Heshbon archaeological dig in Jordan. Let me just tell you the story very briefly. Dr. Horn was a missionary in Indonesia. And when the Second World War broke out, all Dutch were put into prison of war, and he was taken to India and placed in a prisoner of war. This would be a good place to go as a prisoner of war, because he was allowed to take with him or bring with him or get sent to him, I should say, some books out of his own study. He had 60 books sent from his own study to his little prison cell in India, where he was a prisoner of war. And he studied Assyrian history all that time because that was his area of interest and expertise. Not too long after the war was over, he was visiting in Iraq, and he was staying in the home. Actually, the home belonged to the Adventist pastor in Mosul. And while he was staying there in the home, he noticed the children kicking around a couple of pieces of clay tablet. And being somewhat authoritative on clay tablets, he decided to have a little bit of a look. So he picked it up and he sort of suddenly realised, this looks like a king list. And so, with permission, he took these 2 pieces that the kids had been kicking around, and he took them with him back to America. And it was there that he gained permission to then join up these 2 pieces of stone that he had found, or they weren't stone, they were clay tablets, I should say, to join up with where he was staying, where he was doing his study in his PhD, which was Chicago University. And he took them there because they had an Assyrian king list that was 20 years old. And this is theirs, the one on the left-hand side called the Khorshabad king list. But nobody had interpreted it. Nobody could read it. Besides, it was broken and there were holes in it, and they wouldn't get a complete list anyway. But when Dr. Horn came along with his, and they realised that it was the same king list, a copy of it. And his was broken in different places to where the other one was broken. And so that was quite a providential thing. And so before the year was out, under the leadership of Dr. Horn and other people there from that university, they had studied these 2 clay tablets to a great degree, and they had come up with an accurate chronology of the Assyrian kings. Up to the 1950s, people didn't know much about Assyrian chronology and dates. It was quite a thing. It was all over the show. And so this really locked it in. And so here's our Adventist, probably who I would see as the most prominent of our Adventist archaeologists and historians down over the years. He had a major contribution in setting in concrete, as it were, the dates for the Assyrian kings. Now, I thought that would be just a little bit of an introduction to today, and I have popped back on just for a minute, and I'm going over here now, away from the microphone, but I won't be long. I have here, you remember when I took the last lesson, which was on Isaiah chapters 7 and 9, and we established the date of the events of that chapter based on the dates. So notice all these dates down here for the Assyrian kings, and then we've got the the Israelite kings and the Judean kings. And then we established also that there was two dates here that fitted into the Sennacherib, king of the northern kingdom, that there are two dates there that became very important. The reason why I thought I'd just pop this up on the screen again today is because it was really last week's lesson, and Pastor Bill treated that very well and made the observation that yes, there were two attacks by Sennacherib upon Jerusalem, but the lesson last week and this week kept repeating only one attack in the date 701 BC, because amongst scholars there's been division as to was there one attack, which is what you see if you read the accounts in the Bible quickly, but if you go back and study them carefully, you can see that there actually is division of time between the one account and there are two separate attacks. And one of the reasons for it, let me just add this to you, is that the name Tikaka, he became the Pharaoh of Egypt in 690 BC. Now you'll notice that 690 BC would fit in here just 2 years before that second attack. Why do I mention that? I mention that because the Bible actually says that Tikaka was the Pharaoh who was coming out to give Israel support against Tiglath-Pileser. All right? So that immediately sort of separates by a period of time, doesn't it, those two attacks. And so for that reason, I thought I would just share that with you today, because he brought it back up again, and I wanted to tell you that Dr. Horn and Russell Stanley, and by the way, if you want a really good article, I will text it to you or email it to you. It's from William Shea, who is again one of our Adventist biblical archaeologists, and he has written an article for the Biblical Review, and what that article shows very clearly the arguments that support two attacks against Jerusalem. So Adventists generally go along with that, but some don't, obviously. As the author of our lesson, he went with just the one attack. All right, I'm coming now to a more simple timeline, and I'm coming away just for a minute. And the reason why I want you to see this more simple timeline is because I've gone back to the big picture, and we're looking at the nations around the time of Isaiah. Here's Isaiah, just here from about 740. Remember, he mentions that during the reign of Uzzah, and then there was Jotham and Ahaz, and then finally Hezekiah. They were the four kings that were reigning in Judah during the time in which he administers. And we put the date here for his completing of his ministry, because tradition tells us, not the Bible, but tradition tells us that it was Manasseh, Hezekiah's son, who was the one responsible for putting him to death. So that's the reign of Isaiah in there, if you like, or his ministry. And then I want to add some more detail to this map, because this is going to be very helpful. Here we have this 70-year approximately, it's probably just 1 year short in actual fact, but the 70-year period is what we know as the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar came out in the year 605 from Babylon, and he came down and he attacked Judah and carried off captives. Daniel, his three friends, and many others were amongst those captives who were taken back in the first Babylonian captivity. About 10 years later, he came again. And then finally, the year that brought an end to the kingdom of Judah, in the year 587, he came for the third time. And by this time, basically, the Jewish nation as we understand it was gone. There was a governor put in charge of a few remnant people who were left there behind, but most of the Jews, who, if they had not been destroyed in captivity, they were now in Babylon. All right, here's another thing that's going to be important to our lesson today. We know the name, don't we, very well, Cyrus. He's going to come up in the second part of the book of Isaiah. And Cyrus, who was remember it was Darius the Mede, joined with Cyrus the Persian, who brought Babylon to their knees in 539. And then it says that one of the first things that Cyrus did was to create a decree that would set the Jews free to go home, to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, and to become a nation again. Now, as well as that decree was repeated again by Darius the first, not the same Darius who conquered Babylon, and later by Artaxerxes. You remember that story as well, that these three decrees eventually come into effect to make sure that Israel is re-established. So this, whoops, I went backwards instead of forwards here. This now, Israel here, is really the remnant of Judah, perhaps even a small remnant of Israel joined them. And this becomes from here on in the book of Isaiah, when he refers to Israel or Judah, he uses the name interchangeably, he's actually referring to this new Israel. It's like a new Exodus. And for that reason, we're going to find this an interesting part of the study. Now, my last point here at the timeline is this. The book of Isaiah is divided, scholars divided into two parts. Chapters 1 to 39 over here. I've placed it there, as you'll see why in a moment. And then the next part, chapters 40 to 66, is regarded as a second part. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, some scholars believe, in fact, probably most scholars, liberal scholars, believe that there were two people who wrote the two parts of the book of Isaiah. What we notice is this. For example, these first 39 chapters, including the last 4 that we looked in last week's lesson, which was really a narrative, a story about Hezekiah, Sennacherib and so on. But these 39 chapters here, they are the chapters that deal with the story between, in Isaiah's time, between Judah, between Israel, and between Assyria and the conflicts. Remember where the quarter started? We talked about, the Tiglath-Pileser coming, and he eventually carries off and destroys the end, or the next one, Sargon and so on, had a part of that as well. They destroy the end of the kingdom of Israel, and then finally after that, Sennacherib about here, he comes down and he attacks Judah as well, but is unsuccessful in bringing Jerusalem to its knees, as we noticed in the story last week. So that's what the first 39 chapters are about, and it's a lot of condemnation. Now you've opened up chapter 40 this week, and what have you got in chapter 40? Press the button again, Russell. Chapter 40 is introducing us to the fact that now we are looking forward, and we're now going to be covering events about some people of Judah going into captivity, being released by Cyrus, and coming back and establishing Israel again, a new Exodus movement. And it's all joy, it's all positive, isn't it? And it's quite a different tone between 39 and the start of 40. Something's happened there. All right, now I think we'll just leave that there. We'll leave the stick there now, and I'll come back to the microphone. I won't go away from it again, so sorry if you had to do a little bit of adjustment for those who are home. But this, I think, is valuable background for us to understand as we now set in to the second book of Isaiah. And I would like to ask, no, before I even do that, let me ask, how did you feel about this week's lesson? Someone like to make a comment, and there are microphones there that will... who would like to make a comment? How did you feel about this week's lesson? There's a microphone coming if you've got a hand in there. There's one. Thank you, Millie.
Hopeful and heartwarming.
Okay. Helpful and heartwarming. I heard that. Another one. Somebody else have another comment? All right. Here's one. Paul right at the front, and then we'll move into our next point.
Doesn't matter what situation we are in, if we are with God, there is always hope.
Yeah, good. I like that. And that was a very central theme that came through, didn't it? All right, just before we actually go through, and we'll get through in the time that we've got as many of the verses as we can, but before we begin that journey, there is something else I'd like to share with you. Because of these, as we just saw in that last picture, because of what was described as the two parts of the book of Isaiah, many people have suggested that, look, this is, two books here. And here's the reason why. In Isaiah 1 to 35, we have seen the denunciations against the transgressions or the sins of Israel and Judah, etc., and the attacks that will follow. The messages focus on rebuke in those chapters. There are numerous pronunciations of judgments against not only them, but the nations around as well, as you'll notice in the fourth dot point there. However, when we come to 40 and move forward, instead of now finding it a history of the punishments of these nations and the people of Israel and Judah, Now we're finding that it's prophecies, and perhaps, no, it's too late to do it, it's gone. But realise that from Isaiah's time to where the focus of the second part of the book rests, that's right over in the time of the Babylonians, in the time of the captivity, in the time of their return and so on through the pronouncements of Cyrus and others, we're looking 100 to 150 years ahead. So suddenly we've turned from history to prophecy. That becomes a stumbling block for some people. All right? There are promises of the outpouring of God's grace. God's blessings of righteousness and peace are emphasised again and again. There is a glorious future for Israel to be delivered from the power of Babylon and to occupy the promised land. That's the kind of the theme that is opened up and developed here. You have the multiplication, numerous references by Isaiah that give him the title, the gospel prophet, because he speaks about salvation and that so much that, we notice this, it's increased in the second half of the book. You will find, in fact, even in next week's chapter, the faithful servant. We're introduced to this faithful servant, and he's referred to about 4 times in Isaiah, and his deliverance of God's faithful people, that is focused on. And also the work of the Messiah rises to the fore here in these chapters, and the Messianic kingdom that he will set up. The earth is restored to its Edenic peace and beauty. That's been spoken of as well here. And then finally, we find that the second part of Isaiah from 40 right through to 65, not 66, that one chapter accepted, it's all written in poetry. And as the commentary said, most sublime poetry. I'm not a great one for poetry, but I do enjoy what I've read this week from this part of Isaiah. Because of these reasons, people have questioned the authorship of Isaiah. They said, look, this changing style from, in the first 39 chapters to the last 27 chapters, that changing style would suggest it's a different author. However, you stop and think about it. Is changing style really an issue? We'll come back to that in a minute. There's this constant reference to judgment. Yes, the fact that the Messiah is focused on and the Messianic kingdom seems to be coming to focus. It's so different from the first one. So that's their first argument. The second argument they put up is when we see the name of Cyrus come up, who's going to be the great deliverer of God's people in the second part of the book. And modern scholarship here, because of their rejection of the miraculous, because their rejection of the fact that the Lord can see ahead and prophesy precisely what is ahead, because their rejection of that and anything that may seem of a providential nature, they said it must have been written at a later time. All right? So that's their claim. Whereas we're quite comfortable with seeing Isaiah as one person from beginning to end. Because doesn't age, mood and circumstances change your style of writing? As you can see, here are some other arguments. All Old Testament prophets wrote about judgment, focus of the first part of the book, and mercy, focus of the second part of the book. Just the way Isaiah had it written, he seemed to have separated them there. This is an interesting one. The title used for God, and now he uses God and he uses Lord as well, but he uses this expression, Holy One of Israel, a total of 26 times in his book. It is only used 6 times anywhere else in the Old Testament. And the interesting thing is, 12 of those 26 are in the first half, and 14 of them are in the second half, suggesting the same author using a choice phrase. Okay? And here's another one. You go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls make no separate, they don't even have chapter divisions. And there's no separation at the end of chapter 39 and starting of chapter 40. All right? And that's what the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there were several copies of Isaiah, by the way, that came to the fore. And lastly here, the New Testament quotes from the book of Isaiah a total of 19 times, and usually it uses this expression, as written by Isaiah the prophet. It never said, as written by first Isaiah or second Isaiah. No, as written by Isaiah the prophet. And it's interesting to notice that that phrase, again, is proportionately found in the first part of the book, where the quotations come from, or the second part of the book, where the quotations come from. All right? And these arguments, I think, would seem to suggest that, look, one authorship would probably be an appropriate way for us to stick to. And I really see here that this is God working through inspiration with Isaiah. Yes, he's moving away from the focus between Assyria and Israel and Judah, and he's now moving forward 100 years, 150 years. And he's looking at the next part of the story for the people of Judah, who will go into captivity, but who will return to set up the glorious kingdom. All right? So for that reason, I'm quite comfortable staying with this as 1 Isaiah. Now, one last thing and by the way, if you have a Bible, if you want to follow this through in your Bible, because that's all I've got now is just Bible on the screen. If you want to follow this through in your translation, you're most welcome to do so. But one other comment I'd like to make before we move any further, it has been made by others who've been doing the lessons before, but I think it's going to be important for you to see this as you look ahead, is to realise that as you read these chapters, initially I think in Isaiah's mind, he saw this as all being fulfilled as plan 1 by God for the Jewish people. That was plan 1. What was going to happen, if you like, at the end of that timeline we had on the screen. But the reality is, God has the ability through inspiration and with prophets to be able to communicate and share a message. It's a bit like going out and looking down, you know, you're up high in the Great Divide somewhere, and you look out and you see one mountaintop, another mountaintop and another, and they're kind of all lining up together, and it's very hard to see the distance in between those mountaintop peaks. And for that reason, it seems that you could almost describe it as one. And I think that's what Isaiah's got a problem with here. He's looking not only for the future of Israel, plan 1, but God had plan 2. And what happened with the Messiah when Jesus came was the beginning, I believe, of plan 2. And even here we'll find at times that Isaiah's going to break into language that was going to describe a great beauty, you know, beautiful Israel, if this all came about, and it was God's intention that it should have come about. But the reality is, we've taken from that imagery and used a lot of it to describe the condition of the new earth when Jesus comes again. And so there are mountain peaks, as it were, that are lining up in the book of Isaiah. And what we've got to be careful is that we don't try and put all the language on your favourite application, because it may be some of the language is referring to God's first plan. Some of it might be referring to God's second plan. And so that's the difficulty that we have as we move through with the book of Isaiah, and you're going to find that more prominent as we go into the second part. Okay, Isaiah 40. I think, no, might have been a lesson I was listening to. Yes, my cousin's lesson again. I listened to it again, and I remember he made the comment. Now, I've never sung in the Messiah, but he said, and he is a person who has sung, I know, a lot in different locations and situations, and he said, these words of Isaiah 40 stand out in the Messiah. How many people have sung in the Messiah? Yeah, look at all this. You would know the start of this, wouldn't you? Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. Now, this is interesting. How are you going to interpret this? What's this really telling us? Well, the first thing I think that this passage tells us is that it's clear that there is retribution for sin. And for those who move away from the Lord and live that sinful life and transgression that's been spoken of so much in these earlier chapters, there will be retribution. There will be judgment. However, this chapter is now telling us, comfort my people. I've got a good news for you. I'm going to lead you into the second Exodus. This is almost as what Isaiah is saying here. And so he'll begin with the story. Now, the other thing that I find very interesting here, the expression, and by the way, when we're reading, I'm going to return and go to my Bible for reading. It's an NIV, and what I put on the screen is also NIV, but I find I can't find my NIV exact translation because obviously there are updates. I've never been able to find it on the internet, so that when I'm doing this, screen and putting up NIV, thinking it's the same as mine, all of a sudden I find, hey, he's used a different word to what I have, but you're both NIV. So if you see different words while I'm reading from my Bible, please understand that the variations are very small and perhaps clarifying one way or the other. So here it says, she has paid for her sins, and she has received from the Lord's hand double for all their sins. Now, I'm going to ask again a question here. How do you interpret this part of the story? She has received double for all her sins. This is Jerusalem, Judea. Who would like to have a go at that? How has she received double? Yes, Neil. Pastor Neil, sorry.
Yeah, there's several interpretations of that. One is that it's referring to the fact that there was a double captivity, that kind of thing. They've already received that sort of punishment. Another one some have said is that the word double can be referred to folding, doubling over.
Yes.
And then there's one in Zechariah, just notice here, where it says, using the same word, very day I'm declaring that I will restore double to you. So it could be like a double blessing, but I think probably the first one is the most common.
All right. I would agree with Neil's observation here. And like we said before, plan A, and then is there something that we can take away for us today? Yes, I think there is. And Neil's hit on two of those, maybe three. And that is that initially the double captivity, Israel, about 150 years before Judah, was taken into captivity. And now, about 100 it was, and now we find that Judah is going to be taken into captivity as well. All right, so in a sense, God's people have been punished twice for their not being faithful and following the Lord's way. But now things are turning out better. He's forgiven. Look, it says your sins have been paid for. You are forgiven. Except we don't pay for our sins, do we? What does that mean? I think it just simply is a figure of speech. Now, this is where, again, already in Isaiah chapter 40, we've got to be careful because there are so many figures of speech that are used, similes and metaphors, etc., that sometimes don't try and interpret them literally, but there's an idea coming across here. And the idea being, yes, God has forgiven. He's shown mercy now, and the hand of the Lord, at his hand, it would pay double for their sins. One of the stories that I have read for Isaiah, it came out of a Morning Watch book actually, where this verse was quoted, and the author of that book made the point that this word double, as Neil said, also means to fold over. All right? And the Morning Watch book went on to give an illustration how that the people of this time would know the meaning of that word in a very real and personal way as far as bankruptcy was concerned, and as far as there being a good creditor to pay your bankruptcy. Because this is what happened. If you had a business and had become bankrupt, you had to place on your door a notice that declared your bankruptcy. And it would even have the debt, which would probably give people who were owed money the indication they're not going to get anything back because there's a huge debt there. All right? And so, and then a creditor would come along and he would think, all right, I think this is a good man, good business. I want to pay his debt and get him out of bankruptcy. So he would pay the debt, and he was then told to take the note, to fold it over or to double it over and pin it back on the door and write paid in full on it. Well, whether that is how the people in Isaiah's time understood when it said here, received from the Lord's hand doubled or not, I don't know, but I reckon it's a jolly good illustration, isn't it, of what God has done for us. He has taken our debt, he's folded it over, and he's paid it in full, and it's pinned up back on the door for everybody to see. And that's the story of the gospel. All right, we must move on or we're not going to get through this passage. So here's the next part. It says, a voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. A rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. Now, plain, eh? What do you think that is referring to? Where did they in ancient times level the ground and prepare the way? Who did they do it for? They did it for a new monarch, usually, or someone who was of high-ranking, position, even from another country. As they were coming to visit, they would make sure the road was smoothed out and it was all a nice journey right into the area of the palace and so on. And so it is kind of suggesting here from that imagery that this is preparing the way for somebody to come. Now, what that refers to in Plan A, I don't know the rest of the details there. We're not specifically told. It might have been for Cyrus. I don't know. I'm not trying to find an application there. But when we get to the New Testament, when the New Testament under inspiration now can look back at Isaiah and say, hey, that fits this circumstance, then we can say, here is a second application. Who's the second application? John the Baptist. Matthew 3, verse 3, these very words in verse 3 of this passage here, it actually quotes, prepare the way of the Lord, make, straight in the desert, the highway of our God, and so on. And it actually says, and Matthew quotes, as was said by Isaiah the prophet. Okay? So it has an application, doesn't it? A forward application with John the Baptist. And this is a principle that will continue to work in many occasions as we continue to unfold these verses here. All right? One of the things that I found interesting in the pamphlet, it made the observation that in the book of Isaiah, chapter 40, it moves from God's mercy to God's power, back to God's mercy and back to God's power. So we start off with a picture of God's mercy and the coming king, all right? And now we're going to move more into verses that are describing God's power. Notice how it's done here in verses, and I've got to move this forward for you too. All right, that's the end of the passage, by the way, that I should have read before. Now we go to verse 6. And here it says, a voice cries, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? This is what he was to cry. All men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers, the flowers fall, because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord, or the word of our God, stands, how long for? Forever. What do you think this is telling us? What did it tell Isaiah's people? This is a very clear message, I think, that it's showing us that human life is short. We may grow like green grass, and it's growing well this year, isn't it? We can grow like grass, we can blossom like a flower, but grass and flowers, except artificial ones, they last forever. No, they don't last forever, Ethan. But normal grass, normal flowers come to an end. That's what it's like with human existence. Is God like that? As we're going to find out as we go on. No, God is eternal and his word stands forever. That's a very good statement to underline in the book of Isaiah, isn't it? Let's move on. Now, here we come back to pictures of mercy again in these next few verses. And this will go over 2 screens, so let me just read them. You who bring good tidings, or you might have, yes, you've got good news, so that's a good update there. To Zion, go up to a high mountain. You who bring good tidings to Jerusalem, lift up your voice with a shout. Lift it up. Do not be afraid. Say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. That's the good news. Here is your God, the deliverer, as we're going to find out as we proceed. And they are to be, as the pamphlet again said, this is the birth of evangelism. Go up to the mountaintop, wherever you can, shout out the news. Here is your God. And that's the message here. But it goes on a little bit further. Notice the illustrations given here. See, the sovereign Lord comes with power. See, his reward is with him, and his recompense, or meaning his power and his mercy again, accompanies him. He tends his flocks like a shepherd. He gathers his lambs in his arms. He carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that are young. Hey, what great verses to describe the compassion and the care of our loving God and Saviour. And as I read that, I have just, every time I read a passage like this, it flashes, as a little vision flashes through my mind. It's now probably nearly getting towards 70 years old when I first began to see it. But I remember very clearly when we would go out, when Dad would go out and drive the sheep from one paddock to the next, or bring them back to the shed, maybe for lambing or tailing or whatever it might have been. I can still see about 1,000, 1,500 sheep walking, across the paddock, through the gates, down the road towards the shed, etc. And if it was lambing time, guess what? If there was 1,000 sheep running through there, there was the same number of lambs. And that would probably not be an exaggeration, because we couldn't believe how many ewes had twins. So at least that number of lambs. And the further we went, the stragglier the lambs got at the back of the line, particularly those just newly born who were struggling to keep up with the rest of the flock. And of course, there were the mother ewes all going, trying to keep an eye on their lamb and not, But it was an interesting scene. But what Dad did was this. He always took the ute, because the ute had its own made frame, obviously, and all those stragglers were picked up and put on the back of the ute. One after the other, the stragglers went onto the back of the ute. And I remember also that there were some of the ewes that continued to follow, couldn't find their little lamb amongst all these stragglers, so was looking up onto the back of the ute, and some of those became so exhausted trying to keep up with their little lamb that Dad stopped and picked up the ewes and put them up on the ute too. And by the time he arrived back at the shed, the ute was packed full of lambs and ewes. And that little illustration of what I had as a kid on the farm is just like the Lord is doing here. He's tending us, the flock, like a shepherd does. He gathers the lambs in his arms. He carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that are young. And so a great illustration, great imagery comes out there. All right, now we're moving back to an interesting section of chapter 40. It's a long section and we'll move fairly quickly through it. But this section is returning to the aspect of the power of God, the greatness of God, God's supremacy over all the other gods. And it's because of his supremacy, because of his greatness, that he can show the great mercy that is offered in this chapter. So let's begin now. We'll go to verse 12. And by the way, this next phrase, and it goes over 2 screens, there are 5 questions, and they all start with who. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breath of his hand marks off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? Who has understood the mind of God? Whoops, I should be going forward for you. Who has understood the mind of the Lord, or instructs him as his counsellor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? And who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge, or showed him the path of understanding? What does this remind you of? Job, thank you. This sounds like God talking to Job and the counsellors who were trying to comfort him, when God comes up and says, hey, listen, you guys, you got it all wrong. Where were you when I did this? And this is what God is saying here, with all these who questions. No one was around to instruct God when he created. No one was around to give him advice. Because God, in these passages here, is being shown as omnipotent and omniscient. He is both all-powerful and he is all-knowing. And that is a basic understanding that we need to have as we come to God. And then let's move on into the next verse. Yes, I guess we can call them verses because these are the paragraphs as they're broken up. It says, surely the mountains are like a drop in the bucket. what kind of grammatical form is that when it has a, surely the mountains are like a drop in the bucket? It's a simile, okay? And notice, between now and the end, similes and metaphors are flying left, right and centre. It's really a graphic picture of God. So, surely the nations are like a drop in the bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before him, all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. Now, I don't want you to get sidetracked on that till we get over the page on my Bible, where I'm going to bring that statement back in to another picture that's given here. It sounds that God has no value on the nations of the world or the people of the world. All right? So we need to understand this in its context, and it'll be, I think, unpacked as we get to the next phase, as we continue to see here the superiority of God raised against those who try to equal themselves with God. And now we have, by contrast, he goes and compares, what about idols? Look at this. It says, with, verse 18, yes. To whom then will you compare God? What image or idol will you compare him to? As for an idol, a craftsman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and fashions silver chains for it. A man too poor is present, such an offering selects wood that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not topple. So here, by contrast, there is this picture given to Isaiah, which he records here, that, look, compared to this almighty God who had all knowledge, all power there right from the beginning, who didn't need anyone's help, the poor people who worship idols, they get a bit of wood and they carve it up, put a bit of gold or silver on it, and they worship that, and it topples over. He's trying to create, by contrast, where he sits in this story. So now, here's the next part of what I want you to... I would like a response at the end of this. Verse 21. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. Oh, I thought they believed in a flat earth back there. No, it says here, it sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. I'm going to pause there for a moment. I'll come back to the rest of it in just a moment. In that previous reading, it seemed that God had no concern for the nations and the people of the world. And now he says, they're but grasshoppers. In Matthew, it says that God cares more for you and I than he does for even a sparrow when it falls off the perch. God notices that and he cares about that. But here it seems to say, you're just like grasshoppers. I have no care for the nations. Who would like to try and unpack what is Isaiah trying to reach us to here? We've got time for a comment, and then I think, yes, we'll be there by 15:15. So who would like to make a comment? Thanks, Rob.
I think God, through Isaiah, is trying to appeal to the people to gain their respect again. They didn't respect him and appreciate who he was before as this loving, passionate, saving God. And so he's saying, this is how big I am. This is my capacity. And this is what you're like in comparison. So please look to me for salvation.
Right. Thank you, Rob. That's good. Is there another who would like to express their thought, how they see this? Does God value life? Does God value the nations? Are you but grasshoppers? One of the things, remember I said before, that we've got to be careful about when we come to some of the writings of Isaiah at this stage, is the difference between where Isaiah is using illustrations to make a point, using similes, metaphors and other grammatical style and so on to try and make his point. And the point that God is trying to make through here is that God is sovereign. He is over his creation, and that he is over us as people who he has created as well. That is clear, and he certainly makes the point that he's also over the authorities of the world. So let's now finish the reading where this is just unpacked a little bit more. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy. He spreads them out like a tent to live on. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. So no sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground than he blows on them and they wither. And a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. It seems pretty hard, doesn't it, the way they're being treated? No, it's not at all. It is an illustration to try and show that while God sets up people to do jobs for him in the world, and we've noticed that, and we'll notice it again with Cyrus at a later stage, they are still like plants that eventually will die off and wither. And so what we are looking at here then is that just as the plants will wither and die off, yes, they'll come up for a season, but then they will disappear. God never disappears. God stays forever. All right, I'm not sure if that's a message, but I'm nearly at the end, so I can read it from the Bible anyway. And here's the rest of Isaiah and chapter 40, verse 25. And if you see this one come up, yes, it's fine. If it doesn't come up, I'm not quite sure, but maybe it said you've had long enough. I don't know. All right, verse 25, we're nearly at the end of the chapter. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? See, God is creator, isn't he? That's what he's trying to establish here. He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls them each by name, because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. So please, while on one hand we see these illustrations to show God's supremacy, his sovereignty and his almightiness above all his creation, including people, please remember, not one of them, he's now talking about the starry heavens, not one of them is missing. He knows them all. He knows all of us. And now the last paragraph, starting in verse 27. Why do you say, O Jacob, and complain, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord. My cause is disregarded by my God. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary. This is comforting, isn't it? He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. I love these next few verses. In fact, I think these were the only verses of this chapter that were underlined in my Bible before I started this week's lesson. A lot more are now, of course. But listen to what it says. He gives strength to the weary, and he increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary. Young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on the wings of eagle. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. What messages of hope are now being given to the people? Because Isaiah is pointing them forward, as we're going to see in the next few chapters. He's pointing them beyond even their captivity time. He's pointing them forward to a Cyrus who will release them and bring them back to establish what God intended them to be here on this earth. And he describes that in great glory and wisdom. And yet here he says, along the way, some will grow weary and will need strength. He said, look, even young people do that. He says, but God, he said, will give strength to the weary. He will pick up those who are weary. He says, they will soar on the wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. And so here we have it throughout this chapter, a chapter which is a great introduction. It's like a prologue to the rest of the book. And it's basically saying, yes, God is showing us in his almighty nature, his sovereign way. He is over all, he's in control, and he still has a plan for his people. And he's going to lead them through with that plan. And that's, I believe, what we're going to see. And so I have written down here at the end of Isaiah 40, I see God as one who is pretty excited at the moment, giving these messages to Isaiah, and Isaiah is sharing part of the excitement. God is still in control. He comes to deliver. He will come to establish a new Exodus, and he is still active. He's still dynamic. He's still alive, going. God is coming again. Benediction. Our Father in heaven, as we have looked into this passage, it certainly has been a passage which is a real turning point in the book of Isaiah. And as we continue through and complete our studies in these remaining chapters, may we see the gracious love of God as portrayed in the images that we are going to read about and study about in the future. May we see his great plan. May we see the Messiah and the one who comes to be the deliverer, who becomes that patient, faithful servant. We look forward to the time when not only he has been our Saviour, but he will come again and take us to be with him in his eternal kingdom. And that we pray in his worthy name. Amen.